There is something I need to say as honestly as possible, because this subject deserves the truth without unnecessary softness. If I make the language too gentle, the meaning becomes weaker. What we're about to explore is not the familiar idea of justice, where someone who caused pain eventually receives an equal consequence and everything suddenly feels balanced again. Real life rarely works that neatly. What actually happens is much more complicated and in many ways much more believable. This is about the inner psychological experience of an emotionally avoidant person after they deeply hurt someone whose love quietly became one of the most meaningful parts of their life, even if they never openly acknowledged it. Even when their behavior appeared to show distance instead of attachment, that person may have occupied a much larger place in their emotional world than they consciously understood. And when I use the word betrayal, I am not referring only to obvious actions that everyone would immediately recognize. I'm also talking about the quieter kinds of betrayal that leave wounds no one else can see. It is pulling away when someone desperately needed closeness. It is choosing silence when reassurance was needed. It is creating a repeated pattern of warmth and distance that gives someone hope only to slowly take that hope away. It is accepting someone's deep and wholehearted love while giving very little of the same emotional investment in return. These experiences can feel like betrayals even when the avoidant never intended to cause that kind of pain. In many situations, they may not even fully understand what they have done. And that lack of awareness is one of the most important parts of this entire story. The person receiving that behavior feels those moments deeply, not only emotionally but physically and psychologically. Experiences like these can leave lasting marks. Meanwhile, inside the avoidant, another process may begin much more slowly and almost invisibly. Before we can understand what may eventually happen inside them, we have to understand why they were so unaware to begin with. Their lack of awareness was not a minor detail. It was one of the main reasons the entire situation unfolded as it did. They did not understand that hurting you could eventually create consequences they were unable to predict because they never fully understood what your presence meant to them. This doesn't necessarily mean they consciously decided you were unimportant or deliberately dismissed your value. Instead, it can come from the way avoidant attachment patterns influence perception. They may underestimate the importance of a meaningful relationship while they still have access to it. At the same time, they may convince themselves that losing it won't affect them nearly as much as it eventually does. And this is one of the most painful contradictions within avoidant psychology. The same defenses that protect them from the fear of loss can also prevent them from fully appreciating what they have before it is gone. The walls designed to keep painful emotions outside can also block deeper awareness of love, safety, and emotional significance from fully reaching them. Because of this, someone can experience something genuinely rare and meaningful without recognizing how valuable it truly was until much later. And this is where the story starts to change. Because their perception is distorted by those defenses, an avoidant may make decisions without fully understanding what is actually at stake. Every withdrawal, every period of emotional distance, every failure to consistently show up, and every betrayal, whether obvious or subtle, can happen while they are missing important emotional information. They may believe they are walking away from something they can always return to later if they decide they are ready. They assume the relationship can survive repeated neglect, inconsistency, or long periods of distance without permanently changing. They may convince themselves that the connection will still be waiting whenever they finally feel prepared to reconnect. What they don't recognize is that some relationships cannot be repeatedly tested without consequences. Some forms of love are not replaceable, and once they have been damaged beyond repair, no amount of later understanding can completely restore what existed before. Their attachment system can make this reality extremely difficult to recognize while they still have the opportunity to protect what matters. By the time the understanding finally arrives, the chance to make different choices may already have disappeared. What makes this process even more important is that the consequences rarely appear immediately. They often arrive much later, after enough time has passed for those protective defenses to gradually weaken. That delay can change everything because the emotional impact has time to grow underneath the surface without being fully acknowledged. Immediately after a relationship ends, after distance has been created, or after serious emotional damage has occurred, avoidance defenses can become especially strong. Their mind begins doing what it has learned to do for protection. It minimizes painful emotions. It reorganizes uncomfortable memories. It creates explanations that make the situation easier to tolerate. These unconscious strategies can protect them from emotional overwhelm and help preserve the identity they have built around being independent and self-contained. From the outside, this period can look like complete indifference. It may seem as though they moved forward effortlessly, completely untouched by what happened. For the person left behind, this can be one of the most painful parts because it can create the belief that the relationship never mattered to them at all. But this is one of the biggest misunderstandings surrounding avoidant relationship patterns. What appears to be emotional freedom can sometimes be a temporary psychological defense rather than an accurate picture of what is happening underneath. What looks like detachment is not always true indifference. More often, it can be an emotional defense working at full strength. The person is unconsciously using whatever psychological strategies they have available to avoid experiencing the full weight of what happened and what they may have lost. Their calm appearance is not automatically proof that the relationship meant nothing. It may be a sign that they are keeping painful emotions buried because fully experiencing them would threaten the coping system that helps them function. At that stage, they may not feel capable of facing the consequences directly, but defenses have limits. Eventually, reality can become harder to suppress than the emotions themselves. The turning point often begins when they encounter undeniable evidence that the person they once assumed would always remain within reach has genuinely created a life without them. The distance is no longer temporary. It is no longer something they can simply reverse whenever they decide the timing feels right. Instead, they begin facing a permanent absence that quietly tells them the chapter may truly be over. Sometimes that realization comes from seeing that you are no longer emotionally available. Not because you're trying to make a point, not because you want to create jealousy, not because you're hoping they'll suddenly chase you, but because you have honestly moved forward. The emotional energy that once revolved around them has been redirected into your own healing, growth, stability, and peace. You are no longer waiting for them to change. You are no longer organizing your life around whether they return. Your life has developed its own rhythm, and your happiness is no longer dependent on their choices. Other times, the realization comes from seeing a version of you that has completely changed. Maybe they see you during a brief encounter. Maybe they hear something through a mutual connection. Maybe they come across something as simple as a photograph. Suddenly, they see someone who looks calmer, stronger, more confident, and more comfortable within themselves. The quiet self-respect that develops slowly after the relationship becomes impossible to overlook. This version of you can reach beyond the emotional filters that once protected them. It forces them to face a reality they can no longer easily reinterpret or minimize. And this is where the deeper psychological reckoning begins. Stay with me here, because what happens next is not usually dramatic in the way movies portray regret. It is much quieter. But that can make it even more powerful. The first stage happens inside their thoughts. They begin looking at the relationship with a level of clarity that was difficult for them to access while they were still living inside it. For the first time, they may recognize the real value of what they had and the role their own actions played in losing it. This is not simply nostalgia or remembering only the good moments. It can be a sharp change in perception that appears after months or even years of emotional suppression. Memories that once felt ordinary begin carrying a different weight. Conversations they dismissed may suddenly sound different in their mind. Moments they once considered insignificant may become strangely important. They may remember how consistently you showed up, how often you offered understanding, and how many times you tried to keep the connection alive. And slowly, a difficult realization can begin forming. The person they thought would always be there was never guaranteed to remain there. The relationship they assumed could be reopened at any time had a limit. The door they believed they could return to whenever they wanted may no longer be open. That is when regret becomes less about missing someone and more about understanding what their own choices actually cost them. They are no longer simply remembering you. They are beginning to understand the meaning of losing you. And that realization can be much harder to escape than ordinary loneliness. Because these realizations were delayed for so long, they can arrive with tremendous force once those psychological barriers begin to weaken. The version of you they had quietly minimized in their mind is slowly replaced by the person you actually were all along. They start remembering your emotional depth, your consistency, your kindness, and the unusual way you understood parts of them that they could barely understand within themselves. They begin to see that your patience was never weakness. It was a powerful form of strength, loyalty, and commitment that not everyone would have been willing to offer. And as this clearer understanding develops, another layer becomes impossible to avoid. They are no longer simply recognizing your value. They are beginning to confront their own responsibility. That is very different from casually admitting that they made mistakes. It becomes an emotional realization that reaches far beyond simple logic. With enough time and enough undeniable evidence, they begin revisiting each moment with painful clarity. They remember every opportunity when they could have stayed emotionally present but chose distance instead. They remember the conversations where reassurance was needed and silence became their answer. They begin noticing the cycle they created without fully understanding it at the time, moving closer whenever they feared losing you, then retreating as soon as genuine intimacy became possible. They see how they sometimes offered just enough affection to keep hope alive while holding back the emotional openness that a real partnership required. What once seemed reasonable or necessary now starts looking like a pattern that slowly damaged the very connection they quietly depended on. And eventually they have to face the difficult truth that some of their deepest losses were created by the very defenses they believed were protecting them. They start seeing everything with a level of clarity that simply wasn't available before. They remember how often you answered their distance with kindness, how many times you chose understanding instead of anger, and how patiently you carried emotional weight that should never have belonged to you alone. They recognize that your compassion was never something they were entitled to, yet you continued offering it freely. They also begin understanding that they failed to appreciate it while they still had the opportunity. That realization can create something deeper than regret. It can create shame, not merely because they made mistakes, but because someone cared for them with remarkable sincerity, and they responded more often from fear than courage. For someone with strong avoidant patterns, this can become one of the most painful realizations because it forces them to confront a version of themselves they spent years trying not to see. When I say that this kind of betrayal can deeply affect an avoidant's life, I do not mean that everything around them suddenly collapses. Their career may continue, their routines may remain stable, their friendships may still exist. From the outside, they may appear completely successful and unaffected. The consequence is usually much quieter than that, but it can also last much longer. What they lose is not only the relationship itself, they may also lose access to a version of themselves that began emerging through the emotional connection they shared with you. There may have been parts of them that were slowly becoming more open, more emotionally alive, more honest, and more authentic. Your patience, encouragement, and steady presence may have created an emotional environment where qualities they had kept hidden for years could finally begin appearing. That growth was not something you created for them, and it was never something you could control. But the relationship may have provided a unique space where those healthier parts had room to develop. Through repeated withdrawal, avoidance, inconsistency, and emotional hurt, they may eventually destroy the very environment that allowed those parts of themselves to surface. What remains afterward is not necessarily the exact life they had before meeting you. There is now knowledge of what was possible. Before the relationship, they could not miss an experience they had never known. After losing it, they know what deep understanding, emotional safety, and genuine connection can feel like. And that knowledge can change the way their independence feels. The freedom they once celebrated may no longer feel completely satisfying. In quiet moments, it can begin feeling less like freedom and more like limitation. The self-contained identity they worked so hard to protect now carries the awareness that genuine closeness once existed and that they were unable to sustain it. They remember what it felt like to be understood without constantly explaining themselves, accepted without having to perform, and emotionally supported without feeling judged. Future connections may still be meaningful, but some may struggle to reach the same emotional depth. This doesn't mean they think about it every day or remain permanently consumed by the past. Often, it becomes something quieter. It appears during unexpected moments, inside relationships that somehow never feel completely fulfilling, during evenings that carry an unexplained emptiness, or in private thoughts they quickly push away because exploring them honestly would be uncomfortable. But there is another consequence that deserves just as much attention. The experience can change not only what they lost, but also the person they gradually become. Our lives are shaped by the choices we repeatedly make during important emotional moments. People are absolutely capable of growth, healing, and meaningful transformation. But repeated choices also strengthen psychological habits. Every time someone chooses emotional protection instead of vulnerability, those defenses can become easier to use the next time. Every time they retreat instead of remaining emotionally present, withdrawal becomes more familiar. Every relationship where fear repeatedly wins over openness can make authentic intimacy feel less natural. Slowly, the distance between who they truly are and the protective identity they show the world can become larger. The loss does not simply close one relationship. It can reinforce the very defenses that contributed to that loss, making future intimacy harder unless they consciously decide to challenge those deeply established patterns. Because of this, the life they continue living may look completely stable from the outside. They may work successfully, maintain friendships, stay socially active, and appear emotionally composed. People with avoidant patterns can be extremely capable of building lives that look organized, productive, and independent. Yet beneath that surface, there can be a private awareness that is difficult to completely escape. They know something meaningful was offered to them and that they were unable to fully receive it. They know there was a real opportunity for emotional growth, deeper intimacy, and a more authentic version of themselves. But fear felt safer than vulnerability at the time. That awareness may not remain in the front of their mind every day. It may disappear beneath routines, responsibilities, and new relationships. But it can quietly influence how they experience future connections and how they understand themselves whenever moments of honest reflection break through the defenses they've spent years building. And as we reach the end of this discussion, I want you to focus on something more valuable than the idea of justice. It is completely understandable if part of you feels some relief, knowing that your pain was not meaningless and that the person who hurt you is not necessarily living without emotional consequences. That realization can bring comfort, and there is nothing wrong with acknowledging that. But if you stop there, your attention remains fixed on them instead of returning to your own healing. The most important part of this story was never what happened inside the avoidant. It is what has been happening inside you all along. While they may have relied on emotional defenses, you have been forced to face your pain directly. You have had to grieve, reflect, learn, grow, and slowly rebuild without hiding behind emotional distance. That process has strengthened parts of you instead of destroying them. Your ability to love with honesty, accountability, and emotional courage did not disappear because of what happened. In many ways, it became stronger because of everything you survived. The person who hurt you may not have understood what they were risking because the wounds influencing their behavior prevented them from seeing the full value of the connection while it was still available. By the time that understanding arrived, the opportunity to protect what existed may already have passed. They were making decisions with consequences they could not fully see. Fear clouded their perception, causing them to treat something deeply meaningful as though it could always be recovered later. What required honesty, awareness, communication, and courage was instead handled through confusion, distance, avoidance, and self-protection. And the consequences of those choices did not simply disappear when the relationship ended. They continued internally, shaping memories, future relationships, self-perception, and the way they understood what had been lost. But here is the part that matters most for you. Their realization is not the reward for your suffering. Their regret is not the measure of whether your pain mattered. Their future emotional struggle does not need to become your source of closure. You do not need to wait for them to understand what they lost before allowing yourself to move forward. Your healing does not require their confession. Your worth does not depend on their regret. And your future does not need their participation. What happened may have changed you, but it does not have to define you. You can take the lessons without carrying the wound forever. You can remember the love without returning to the place where you were repeatedly hurt. You can understand their defenses without excusing the damage they caused. And you can finally choose yourself without needing them to understand why. That is where the story becomes yours again. They became part of the avoidance itself, quietly shaping the way they experienced their own emotions long after the temporary comfort of pulling away had disappeared. The relief they found by building emotional walls was never permanent, but the cost of continuing to live behind those walls could last much longer. And that matters because it reminds you of something important. Your experience was real. What happened between you was real. The emotional consequences did not exist only on your side of the relationship. The impact reached much further than the moment everything finally broke apart. But even more important than what happened inside them is what happened inside you. While they were protecting themselves from emotions they didn't know how to handle, you were doing something far more difficult. You were facing those emotions directly. Through heartbreak, confusion, disappointment, uncertainty, and grief, you slowly built something that nobody else could simply give you. You developed a sense of self-respect that no longer depends on another person's approval. You discovered an inner confidence rooted in your own character rather than someone else's ability to recognize your value. You learned that your ability to love deeply was never a weakness. It was one of your greatest strengths. And you also learned that you deserve a relationship where that love is met with consistency, honesty, presence, and genuine commitment. None of this growth happened by accident. It wasn't merely an unexpected side effect of suffering. It became one of the most meaningful parts of your journey. The experience began as something that wounded you, but slowly it became something that revealed your own strength. The other person entered the relationship without fully understanding what they had. Because they could not clearly see its value, they made choices that gradually damaged something genuinely rare. And in losing you, they also lost the opportunity to continue becoming the version of themselves that your love may have encouraged them to discover. Your presence created emotional space where they could have moved beyond old defenses and experienced a more honest way of connecting. But they could not recognize the value of that opportunity until it was no longer available. You, however, experienced a very different outcome. Even though you went through confusion, emotional distance, silence, disappointment, and the long process of putting yourself back together, you did not lose the most important part of who you were. Instead, you found it. You discovered a deeper understanding of your worth, stronger boundaries, greater emotional awareness, and a clearer connection to your real identity. The growth did not erase the pain, but it gave that pain a meaning that extended far beyond the relationship itself.